We're going to begin this webinar right now. It's now exactly 7 o'clock and we expect others to join us as they can. My name is Marilyn Bardet and I'm a founding member of the Good Neighbor Steering Committee, and I will be serving as host tonight for this evening's GNSC Candidates Forum. I welcome each of our candidates for mayor, Christina Strawbridge and Steve Young, and for city council, Tom Campbell, Trevor Macenski, and Terry Scott. And I welcome the public attending, all of you who take a great interest in our town. Thank you all for your participation. This forum was created independently by the Good Neighbor Steering Committee without any financial donation or other support from any outside source, individual, commercial, or corporate. First, a word or two about the Good Neighbor Steering Committee's long history as a citizens environmental watch group. A number of us founded the original group in 2000 when Valero purchased the Benicia Refinery from ExxonMobil. Of that momentous ownership change, we said then, a cloud of uncertainty is hanging over Benicia. We feel this uncertainty hanging over us now, 20 years later. Over 20 active years, our credibility has been earned by our persistent commitment to fact-finding and asking pertinent questions, and to evidence-based persuasion and advocacy on behalf of the community for public health and safety and for a healthy environment. We've met many challenges. For the record, over the years, our members have participated in establishing the city's first Benicia Community Sustainability Commission, as well as the city's Climate Action Plan. In 2003, we commented and legally challenged the EIR for the refinery's decades-long Valero Improvement Project, we refer to as VIP. In 2009, when Valero proposed further changes to their facility under the EIR, we went to bat to challenge their EIR addendum on procedural as well as substantive grounds. As a result, with pro bono legal counsel provided by local land use attorney Dana Dean, we negotiated a settlement agreement with Valero that provided approximately $14 million for environmental projects that support water and energy savings benefiting both the city and the community. In 2010, the city of Benicia became a party to the amended agreement, at which time, with dedicated settlement funds, the closed Mills Elementary School was transformed into Benicia Community Center. GNSC members have addressed various major planning and development proposals. From 2013 to 2016, we actively participated with Benicians for a Safe and Healthy Community to challenge and defeat Valero's proposed crude by rail project. Most recently, we initiated a second amendment to the settlement agreement that, as adopted, reallocated $1.4 million to 4 major projects selected by the GNSC for funding, including the Benicia Community Air Monitoring Program, for which a nonprofit has recently been established. This is the first time, though, that we're attempting, for the sake of public education, to host a candidates forum to spotlight certain issues of concern to the public regarding the future of our city, climate change, and the city's and communities' relationship to the refinery. I'm going to go over the protocols for the webinar. The webinar format we've chosen will not include interaction with the viewing audience or with me. This is not a debate. We've asked candidates to frame their answers to stand alone, representing their own thoughts on a topic. A candidate may refer to another's response, but not in the form of a rebuttal or rejoinder to anyone else's comments. As host, I will ask each candidate to respond to each question with an order established alphabetically. We will begin with mayoral candidates first and council candidates second. To be fair, I will rotate the order so that with each question posed, a different candidate will go first. All questions were drafted by the GNSC. All candidates, and only the candidates, were sent the questions in advance with background information for context. This was done to allow the candidates to study and prepare for tonight's forum. In the interest of time, I will not be reading the background info provided, but I will be announcing the topic areas for each question. Each candidate will have up to 3 minutes to answer, and our co-host, Constance Butel, will be monitoring the time. She will be either raising a sign or saying 30 seconds, please. The GNSC members and the webinar attendees will appreciate succinct and clear answers. We hope this evening's forum will be educational for the candidates and the viewing public alike. For the public's benefit, because we are especially concerned in this forum to discuss the city's and community's health, safety, and our future in relation to the Valero Refinery, we thought it important and appropriate to remind candidates of the conflict of interest rules and advisories under the Political Reform Act dated August 2015 that is under jurisdiction of the State of California's Fair Political Practices Commission. I'm sure you're all aware. The Political Reform Act is for public interest. The Political Reform Act applies to all elected appointed officials and employees working for government at every level. The Act states, and I quote, "In order to prevent a conflict of interest, a public official should, 1, identify and fully disclose the financial interests that may cause a conflict, 2, understand the different types of financial interests that may be the basis for a conflict, and 3, consider whether the decision's effect on the official's financial interest is reasonably foreseeable and material." The Act details these precautions. According to the FPPC, the Act relies, and I think this is important, the Act relies on individual citizens to monitor the decision-making of the elected and appointed representatives to identify whether they have a conflict of interest with respect to a specific decision. Much of the enforcement of the Act's conflict of interest provision is based on citizens' complaints. In other words, these are things that I would say help democracy, help people to be paying attention to their electeds. If elected, a key question is whether you would declare any conflict of interest, including perceived conflict of interest, in any decision-making that would specifically involve the Valero Refinery. The public needs to know. And I'm not posing that question to any of you. I'm just stating that that is of interest. Topic area 1, air quality and PM 2.5, and that's particulate matter at 2.5 microns, or let's say PM 2.5 or less, smaller. So here's question number 1, and the first question goes to Christina. Because acute and chronic exposure to PM 2.5 is a serious health risk, especially for children with developing lungs, the elderly, and people with pre-existing health conditions, what responsibility will you take as an elected official to ensure that Benicians are well informed of the multiple health risks associated to chronic exposures to toxic air pollution, including PM 2.5?
Just to kind of hit on the topic of the question, first and foremost, the evaluation of health risk exposure has come forward within the kind of atmospheric and planning community probably over the last 5 or 6 years. Obviously, point source evaluations related to stack modeling has been in place for a long time in accordance with the Clean Air Act.
Could you speak up a little bit, Trevor? I can't hear you too well. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me all right? Is that better?
That's better.
Okay. The implementation of guidance surrounding how to evaluate health risk within communities is, I don't want to say a new science, but it's actually finding its way into our municipal and approval process within the last 5 or 6 years. In 2016, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District actually came out with guidance that's called New Source Review Health Risk Assessment Guidelines for how to evaluate health implications on communities. And there's 2 functional things you need to know about. One is to evaluate health risk at kind of a project and approval level. So you have something new that comes into your community and you want to determine what the implications of that risk are going to be on your constituents or the community itself. Now, when you do that, you identify the source in both a short-term and or a long-term exposure potential. So you can look at construction level health risk assessments, which oftentimes evaluate what a lot of other folks have talked about here, which is particulates that are disturbed, usually in like a dust-based particle for a short period of time. But usually health risk, depending upon the constituent, is evaluated on two types of timeframes. One is a 70-year exposure period, and that's for like a residential source or a sensitive use. And the second is actually a 30-year exposure time for like a worker or construction. So when you're doing that, you can do it in both the construction time frame, like I had mentioned, but you can also do it in a long-term operational or cumulative time frame. Now that cumulative exposure is important because that's where you actually start adding additional sources beyond just one individual project, right? So in our community, for example, say you add the diesel particulate emissions associated with 780 and the vehicle traffic that actually traverses through our community, or the port operations and the prevailing wind pattern associated with that, or the refinery, or whatever this new project is. So the state actually in the last few years has implemented some guidance under SB 1000. So SB 1000 was a bill which required communities to evaluate and implement environmental justice evaluations. To do that, you have to identify these new sources of health risk which are established within a community as an inventory as part of your next general plan update process. So when we go through and we update our general plan, we will be able to cumulatively identify where those sources come to and are coming from in our community. And the last thing that I would just mention is just the Plan Bay area also has an equity analysis that did it holistically.
Thank you. Air Quality Management District, which we refer to as BAQMD, involving community air monitoring and public health concerns. And a question about Valero's property tax assessment. We're giving everybody 5 minutes because there are 4 parts, and what I'm going to do is read each part to you separately so that we can distinguish between these parts. Is everybody in agreement with that? Elected official, what actions would you take to ensure that the city and Valero cooperation agreements terms are fulfilled for better communication?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that we need to make sure that we do is, as Steve had mentioned, is we got to fill that staffing position. And I think that the easiest way to try to have accountability around that is make sure that we, at every city council meeting, have an update from our department heads relating to the status of existing outstanding staffing and hiring needs by each department. And furthermore, I think what we need to do is set a performance metric to identify by which time we feel it's unacceptable that we haven't at least interviewed or sourced candidates. And if we haven't by that time, we have to enter into negotiation with the refinery to pay for a private recruiter to try to fill that position, because the implementation of that piece is going to be critical to our community's communication with our civic leadership and the refinery as well. I think the chief's doing a great job right now, but obviously he's got other things to do as well. So I think that's an easy way that we could try to solve that problem.
Great. What will you do to ensure the city's cooperation with the Air District to fulfill the district's commitment to get a community-based air monitoring station set up in our town?
Well, as you know, when we both sit on the community advisory panel, we went through this process of having the district come talk to us and explain the rationale and methodology of why they tried to identify that particular location and get the understanding of how the predicted, Gaussian dispersion modeling would impact our community relative to the wind directions. And, the part that I never really felt too comfortable with was that selection protocol and only that, right? I think it should have been a phased program. If the community had raised a concern saying that we want additional monitors, I think we can have a conversation about, okay, so we're agreeing to this one initially, but if you're going to phase it out, where would they go? And what additional benefit would you get from those monitors? Because I think that that's a piece that's missing from understanding how that data will play into decision making. To the point related to the school district, I actually had a conversation with some of the folks that sit on the school district's board and trying to understand why this is not happening. And it's as simple as the fact that the school district doesn't want it on the property because they have a planned CIP project in the location which it's been identified to go. And so you have, again, a fall down in communication between our existing civic structure to where the city council isn't talking to the district. And we thought we had the problem solved. And then when we come to actually try to implement it, we're trying to put an improvement where they're already planning something for their particular campus expansion.
Very good. Would you consider appointing someone from the council to attend BAQMD meetings and or those stationary source committee meetings that have to do with refinery performance, et cetera?
Absolutely. I think, having any educated mind that's actually in the room that can represent our community's interests is absolutely what we need. As Steve had mentioned, the representatives that are currently on BACMA's board have a different perception of what particular challenges may be. And I would also add that there's other, our neighboring city, the city of Vallejo, has actually been identified as part of the Plan Bay Area resiliency effort and Plan Bay Area as a community that is disproportionately impacted relative to racial demographics and income as well. And so I would actually advocate that our neighbors probably have more of a say to say that they should sit at that table than we do, as we have studies that show that they're actually getting more disproportionately impact from such upwind refineries as Mr. Campbell had mentioned.
Thank you. What will you do to ensure that Valero is properly and fairly assessed?
Yeah, so I had to go look this one up too, and kind of that procedural process. So what I did learn about it is, so this is kind of where the Board of Equalization comes in, and they actually have a guidance document which needs to get implemented by each one of the county assessors. And that county assessor has to use this guidance document for petroleum facilities. And I guess that there's a specific methodology in which they have to actually appraise that. And in that document, there's a improvement and a reduction scheme calculation depending upon what types of improvements have taken place over time. So as a city representative, what I would want to do is work with the county to make sure that we can at least back check their assumptions and how they're implementing that implementation methodology. And hopefully we can try to work amicably to try to make sure it's a reasonable amount of money. Obviously, as Tom and Steve have mentioned, it's a big sticking point because it becomes a lot of money at the end of the day related to the assessment. If push comes to shove, we got to have conversations with the refinery, and if we have to go to lawsuit, then we got to go to lawsuit.
Topic area 3. The Air District's Regulation 12 Rule 15 required approved real-time fence line monitoring systems at all Bay Area refineries with reliable public reporting of raw data in real time. And we want to know about the status of Valero's compliance. So here are the questions, and we'll start with Tom Campbell. Good science requires independent validation of data. Under the City of Benicia Valero Cooperation Agreement, will you commit to asking for independent validation of raw data collected from fence line monitoring systems and for access to archive data for independent third-party review? And this is part 2. What would you do to ensure that the amended settlement agreement's requirement for installing a 4th fence line pathway system on the northwest side of the refinery facing Southampton neighborhoods is accomplished and that the system is reliably operating?
I got it in front of me. Yeah, so the one thing that I just wanted to point out is that the point in which we're at related to rule development and regulation is just the frame of reference of like beta testing the first Prius versus being today and the advantages of Tesla. The rule regulation and formulation of development was well-intentioned, but the industry has to catch up with a level of technology to support that particular regulation. As Tom had mentioned, there was a company out of Oregon which was originally identified to come up with the technology to actually get a confidence interval related to the reporting. And if we can't get that, unfortunately, that's going to be the hinge pin in everybody's want to understand what the fence line program is going to do. I absolutely think that I'm confident that we can, and hopefully it'll happen before 2021, because I think it should. But if you look in the air quality fence line monitoring plan that BACMA approved, there's actually a subchapter related to quality, and in it it says all actions will be documented in the data management system and required to retain raw data with traceability of all actions that result in the final data. So the DMS system actually has to track whether there's modifications or not. And I absolutely think that we need to have a third-party vendor verify that. And I think that the city and the Good Neighbor Steering Committee should be part of that decision-making panel, because oftentimes, that's going to be an outside consultant that's going to be verifying that data to make sure that the numbers don't change. So I absolutely would support that. The second piece about the 4th pathway. So the 4th pathway and implementation, unfortunately, if we want to see that happen, it has to go into the fence line monitoring plan, because that's going to be the push and the push and pull that we're going to go back and forth with the refinery on is if we want 4, but the plan says 3, then they're only actually required to implement 3 because that's what the regulator who controls the resource is telling them that they need to do. So what we need to do is, in the event that we have to reopen the plan, have a conversation around how we can accommodate the 4th fence line into that implementation of the plan. And I guess furthermore, before we do that, I just want to make sure that the technology piece associated with how we're actually going to be collecting that data works before we just jump to adding in another source. But
I do have to clarify one thing, though. It was part of the settlement agreement, the amended settlement agreement agreed to by the city, Valero, and the Good Neighbor in 2019. And so that expectation, and Valero was quite willing to add that and was, so I think it is something we can add, that we expect compliance on, according to the agreement. To greenhouse gases and toxic emissions, and the status of the reductions of those emissions to date, and the City of Benicia's Climate Action Plan, which, in my opinion, this is to add one little tidbit here, needs updating. And so I'll get to the question. The public has a right to know the current level of greenhouse gas emissions and reductions achieved by Valero and the Port of Benicia. As called for under the Climate Action Plan, what will you do to encourage further emissions reductions, including greenhouse gases, at the Valero Refinery, including its port terminal operations and asphalt plant, as well as to encourage reduction of emissions resulting from import shipping activity at the Port of Benicia?
yeah, so this is a great question, and I want to start off with, I agree that obviously as part of the Climate Action Plan, you develop something called an emissions inventory. But the problem with that is that data is only as good as when you collect it. And so the data that was collected as part of the greenhouse gas emission inventory goes back to like 2014, I think is when it was actually finalized. And in that table, there's a table in that document which identifies the sources that you specifically reference. And they roll the units into CO2 equivalents because all different types of sources put off different types of greenhouse gases, right? So you try to neutralize the unit type by using CO2 equivalent. But you can actually look up on the EPA's website through the mandatory rule reporting process, the particular reported CO2 equivalent. And I did that for the refinery because I know that the last time that we had talked, you had asked for that. So the Valero Refinery in 2018 is the number that's in the EPA system, reported 1,945,637 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And through that process, when they submit that through the EPA, actually the California Air Board verifies that number. Now, if we want to break that down related to the asphalt plant that's actually there, we would have to work with the refinery to determine what the allocation of those use types are. Furthermore, I couldn't find imports in the system because it's a different reporting, but I will absolutely try to track that down so that we can try to identify how much CO2 equivalent they have. But the only way that we're going to be able to get the level of detail that you're wanting and accountability is making sure that, just like we do with our general plan and implementation of staffing priorities, is use the Climate Action Plan as a tool to have progression over time and have staff report to us what measures we feel have actually been implemented to reduce the emissions goals set in that plan. And I think that that's one way, not only for the Planning Commission, but also the City Council to hold accountability in the implementation of the CAP.
Topic area, because it deals with our future and global warming and what we can do about it locally in our own, bailiwick, and through what we can do through our council and advocacy. So this is the topic area: perspectives on current changing operating conditions among Bay Area refiners, the future of Valero Refinery in Benicia, State of California climate goals to achieve drastic GHG reductions by 2050 to bring about a net zero carbon economy, and the City of Benicia's response to a recently published research report titled Decommissioning California Refineries, Climate and Health Paths in an Oil State, a Communities for a Better Environment report dated July 2020, brand new, which proposes annually phased reductions at approximately 5% in refinery production capacity to meet state climate goals. So the question is, Valero's stated intention is to be the last man standing among Bay Area refineries. Valero is committed to processing dirtier crude oil slates for gasoline, jet fuel, and other products. What is your current level of concern about global warming and for reducing refinery emissions, including GHG, in relation to state targets to slow global warming and create a zero carbon economy by 2050? Trevor?
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of try to pick up on climate science after the reporting of change, right? So I think that the idea around climate science and how it applies to California is important to our community. So if you start with the fact that climate change is real and global warming will oftentimes is projected to result in sea level rise, the biggest challenge that we have for our community is actually how that sea level rise will interact with our community. Now, over the past, few decades, we've risen about 8 inches or so, but by the end of the century, we're looking between 20 and 55 inches. And I was actually just presenting on community adaptation to sea level rise to the Association of the American Civil Engineering Association of the Bay Area on how communities can adapt. And our biggest threat, because the majority of our population in California was within close distance to the water, is that it puts about $100 billion worth of property and infrastructure at exposure risk. And we're no different. Our wastewater treatment plant and the surrounding energy and roadway infrastructure, which is critical to our community, is actually at the highest risk level when identified by the state. The idea that the refineries' air quality emissions are tied to that is absolutely true. I'm not going to try to dismiss that. But I think that the point that Tom made about kind of their position in the marketplace is an interesting one. The only thing that I would add in addition to that is that I do think that we're probably going to see other refineries in the state of California close. Do I feel that it's going to be Valero? No. Similarly, for the same reasons that Tom mentioned, in that it's the newest refinery within the state. And because of that, it is also one of the safest. We've actually seen a consolidation trend within the oil and gas industry over the last decade or so. And actually, the closest one is our neighbor across the way in Martinez, the old Shell refinery. And I think it's some hedge fund or PBF or something bought them. And I would say that in itself is probably going to be the next one that will likely close. So do I think that our community is in a stable position related to our refinery and as an operator? Yes. Would I like to see them continue to put infrastructure investments in place that will allow them to reduce their greenhouse gas and emission footprint? Absolutely. The 10-year-old project of the scrubber was a lot of foresight and how they can exist and operate within the environmental regulations that are in California. And I think if they continue to make those investments, I think that would be great for our community. However, I do want to make sure that my point is taken, that I would rather have a Valero operator than like a hedge fund, because the hedge fund does not put the safety and security of its constituents and its company. They manage a refinery a lot differently. So that's all. Thanks, Marilyn.
Thank you very much. You've all proven that this can be it's so educational to have this level of discussion amongst you. And I don't think we've ever had that level of focus in this kind of way at a council meeting. Well, you wouldn't expect it at a council meeting because of all the rigmarole to get things on an agenda. But I really hope that we'll have more opportunity for public workshops so that people can come to understanding about these things, and that you are involved with those levels of discussion would be extraordinary. And in these times with global warming, which we now feel so intimately with these fires where we can't go outside, we are learning something every day about our own tolerance level for what this holds for us if we don't do things to address global warming and slow this down. And you've all contributed very important things to the discussion. I did hear some things that I could have commented on, me personally, from my reading and etc. But this just is the beginning. I'm hoping this will be an open opportunity to propose workshops, etc., where the public is involved and can come and learn more. But you've set the stage, and I'm glad that we took this risk, in a sense, for the Good Neighbors Steering Committee to host this. So I want to thank you very, very much for participating. We've had up to about 58 attendees. We thank the public for hanging in there on these rather complicated subjects and focused commentary on Valero. And we believe that everyone should vote. You know, those of you who are attending, your vote is so important so that we hear your voice. And the counts, I think we're very lucky to have the council slate candidates that are running. I'm very glad for this. The people running that will have fresh opportunity for these kinds of discussions. I just want to announce that we will be, we've recorded this webinar. It will be available on YouTube, and Constance Butel may try to edit it so that we have the actual webinar as it progressed, and then also each of you with your own responses to these questions. And I would like to figure out a way to get our questions and the background information that we offered out to the public as well, and I'm sure it's possible. So we did a pretty good job sticking to the time. It's now 8:42. So on that note, I would like to close, unless anybody has any questions that you think pertinent to wrap this. Not any big statement, but if there's any question. And also, I just would like to say, since some of you brought up about the Benicia Community Air Monitoring Program, BCAMP, and the nonprofit that has been established and what we're doing, and we will very much appreciate being able to tell you about that. We're very excited. It's happening. So with that, I'd like to thank you and say good evening to you all.